Kia ora koutou, back again. I've been arguing recently that sustainable livelihood is a really good way to approach, one really good way to approach SDG 8, decent work and economic growth. I've also argued that living wage is a case in point when speaking about Project GLOW. It's a really useful lens, I think, to examine sustainable livelihood. But we also know that the SDGs are supposed to be interconnected, and that raises the question, well, can a living wage lens be used to help see the interconnections between all the other SDGs, the other 16 of them? And I'm actually just going to go around the SDG clock face behind me to explore that question and see where it leads us. So if we start with SDG 1 at 1 o'clock, no poverty, well, we've been looking at ways in which a living wage might actually be a threshold that gets people out of poverty traps. Moving to SDG 2 at 2 o'clock, zero hunger. Well, maybe we could then ask, well, does a living wage actually help people to get out of hunger, escape from hunger traps, if you will? And is that sort of like the same sort of thing, a threshold value that gets people away from hunger and leaves zero hunger in its wake? What about SDG 3, good health and well-being? Well, does a living wage lead to improved health and well-being? And if so, what kinds of forms does that take? And what is the relationship exactly? Number 4, quality education. Does a living wage actually enhance access to education for the worker, for their household, and for their children and subsequent generations? What about SDG 5, gender equality? Does paying a living wage actually help to close the gap between men and women and different genders in the workplace over things like wages and income and access to opportunities, for example? Number 6, water and sanitation. Does earning a living wage actually mean that people have better access to clean water and health and sanitation? What about SDG 7, which is access to sustainable energy? If you earn a living wage, or if people earn a living wage, does that promote access to clean and sustainable forms of energy? SDG 8, we're already addressing decent work and economic growth through a living wage. But what about number 9, SDG 9, inclusive growth, for example, for small to medium enterprises? How does a living wage impact upon inclusive growth of those small to medium enterprises and the workers within them? What about SDG 10, inequality? Does paying a living wage actually help to put the brakes and maybe even reverse income inequality that's growing still around the world? What about SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities? Well, does paying a living wage actually help with people's housing, for example? What about 12, sustainable consumption? Does paying a living wage, for example, through fair trade to coffee producers, actually enhance sustainable consumption? Well, we have people in the GLOW network actually asking that question. Does fair traded coffee, for example, actually taste better? What about number 13, climate change? Does paying a living wage help to focus society on issues, growing, pressing issues, notably climate change? What about SDG 14, life underwater? Does paying a living wage mean that there might be less exploitative fishing, for example, preserving fish stocks and thereby sustaining life underwater by paying boat crews living wages, for example? SDG 15, sustainable forests and life on land. Does a living wage enable better chances for forms of life on land to better sustain? And number 16, SDG, peace and conflict in society. Does paying a living wage lead to less violent crime, less internal division and more peaceful societies? And finally, SDG 17, the only process goal, partnership for development. Well, can we look at a living wage as a form of partnership across, for example, global supply chains, and also between researchers who are looking at living wages as a way of addressing the SDGs in general and SDG 1 in particular, the primary goal? And so we come full circle and we see quite readily that the living wage is a lens that enables us to address sustainable livelihood and thereby contribute to all the SDGs. Kia ora koutou.